Hello, everyone. So this is my prediction video for the US election in 2024. I have put this off for quite a while because I thought there would be more twists and turns, and there might be still. I'm recording this on the 16th of October. And before I get into this, I'm going to say that actually I don't even know what I'm going to predict until the end of this. So I've done this purposely in this way because I've been back and forth looking at both charts, and at sometimes I was looking at Trump's chart thinking he was on top, and then at other times I was looking at Harris and thinking she was on top. And I kind of have an idea in my mind, obviously, of what I'm going to predict, but I'm not going to give you that prediction right at the beginning because I want you to see the process that an astrologer like myself goes through in order to make a prediction. So that's why I almost wanted to just kind of do this sort of spontaneously, coming on and sort of after a time of leaving everything aside, coming back to their charts and looking at all of the many things, many things that you have to look at. And I do think I'm going to share some things here that not all astrologers, Vedic astrologers, are sharing, some perspectives. So that's why I do think it's worth looking at my process and how I then come to a conclusion if I actually do. I'm not even sure I'm going to come to a conclusion. It might be inconclusive. That might suggest also that I do think, I really do think though, whoever wins or whoever, let me put it this way, whoever becomes the president, it's not a straightforward route. Whether that's as extreme as a contingent election, which hasn't been seen in the US for, I think, nearly 200 years, or it's just one person, getting the vote, but then it being contested, as a lot of astrologers are alluding to or, outright predicting. So I do think this is not straightforward. This is why I think it's not an easy call for sure. So let me share the charts first of all, and we'll get into this. So first of all, I'm going to bring up, let's go alphabetical order. So let's look at Harris's charts first. And there's a few charts to share here. So her birth chart, obviously, but also her yearly charts, both the solar return, which is coming up actually. She was born on the 20th of October, so she's having her solar return in a few days. But also the solar lunar return, or soli-lunar return is called the Tithi Pravesh. Tithi means the lunar day. So it actually traces the sun as it comes into the same sign, which has to be Libra for Harris. But then it also looks at the moon, the full moon phase, which is actually on the 17th of October this year. So that's actually her solar and lunar return chart. So you got three charts to look at. And in fact, what I'm going to finish this video on as well is looking at the US chart, the Sibly chart, and the sidereal Sibly chart more specifically to highlight what I think will show the themes. And in a way, I think that chart is going to be more telling because we can get so lost in the sort of minutia of all these charts, the three charts for each candidate. But if we take a kind of step back and we look at the Sibley chart, the US chart, we can see what the theme is. And I do think that points to one person in these two people, at least, because again, there could be some other twists and turns, I don't know, before the actual election day. But in relation to Harris v. Trump, there's one person that particularly sort of highlights the zeitgeist in the US, in the US Sibley chart. But there's a caveat there because if we bring in the vice president candidates charts, and actually I can't bring in both because I don't have a time of birth for Tim Walz. JD Vance's chart could be one to look at. I'm going to say it now. I do think that his chart highlights something. Now, whether that's Trump being elected and then not being able to fulfill his duties as president, and then JD Vance stepping in, or it's something as may happen. It's not outside the realms of possibility that actually there is a contingent election and that Harris is elected president. And I just wrote it down here because I'm not really familiar with all of the ins and outs of the process, but basically the House would elect the president. So Harris is elected president by the House, not the popular vote by the people, but by the House. And that the Senate elects the vice president, which could be JD Vance. That's I don't think anyone's predicted that, but that's kind of way out there, you might think. But another way, is it? So Harris becomes the president and JD Vance becomes the vice president. I'm not saying that's my prediction. I'm gonna again wait till the end of this video and I'm gonna make it. But why I say that though, as a potential, is because Harris's chart, and when we look at her chart now, we'll see it's just not the kind of chart that on its own, as a kind of a president um to be, it's just not that kind of strong chart. It really isn't. It's almost like as just as she's been given this nominee position, it's almost like her chart really highlights more getting something by default. So that to me suggests that she's not just getting elected straight out winner and that's it. She's voted president and that's it. She becomes president. I mean, it could be, but like I said, she's already been set up. Let me put it this way. I know this might offend some people, but we have to kind of just think of this astrologically. Her chart, as we'll see, is just not a clear sort of outright strong chart for a leader. It's a leader by default. It's a leader. It's a person who usurps the leader's position, in fact. But she's already done that. She's already done that because she has replaced Joe Biden. Let's not forget. I don't think Kamala Harris would be in any way in a position to become the president of the United States unless she was handed it in that way. This kind of literally, let me just show you. There is basically a yoga in her chart. If you're not familiar with the South Indian chart here on the left-hand side, this is her birth chart, her ninth division, and her 10th division over here, where we look at the more specifics of her career. The birth chart here has the Gemini rising with the north node of the moon very closely conjoined, Rahu, the north node. This is obviously shown somebody who is a usurper, essentially. That's what Rahu is. If you read anything about Rahu, the north node in Vedic myth, it's all about slipping in and obtaining the Amrita and gaining power and immortality. So she is that. So that's why it's likely that if she does become president, it's not through a direct route of getting elected, popular vote. She becomes president, plain sailing, straightforward. I don't think that's going to happen in any way. I could be wrong. I could be wrong about that because, again, it may be that she has already usurped the role by taking it from Joe Biden. Could be that. But if we see here, the yoga that she has, a combination between Sun and Venus, which is very activated right now. Sun and Venus. So Venus is in the Sun sign, Leo, and Sun is in Libra, Venus's sign. So they're swapping signs. This is called a mutual exchange. This is her, and this is third and fifth house mutual exchange. So that's fifth house's political power, by the way. And third house is about getting something, grabbing something. So this exchange between these two is the reason why I thought she would be in this position in the first place. And I did predict this previously. I didn't think Joe Biden would finish out his term. He seems to be finishing out his term, but I didn't think he would, and that she would then become president. I thought she would become president because of Joe Biden not finishing his term. What's happened is he has given her the nominee, but he's still president. This is the thing, he's still president. And it looks like he will be finishing out the presidency, or will he? I don't know, because he has to last until inauguration day in January. So I don't know. She still could become president. This is the thing. This is another kind of twist. She could still become president before the next inauguration and then not be president after that. I mean, that's also potential. There's so many different wacky things that could happen in the next few months. And by the way, it's not just me saying that because I'm reading reports of things that could go on. I'm looking at the astrology, and the astrology is wacky. There's a lot of different things going on. But at any rate, this exchange between Sun, Venus is just her getting power. That's Sun power, fifth house, political power, through some other means, by default in a way, handed it in some other way. Now, it's just whether or not she's already been handed it in a way, and it's kind of like she's now plain sailing winning, or just about winning, like edging it, or is it that she gets this election through some other means, like a contingent election? I don't know. Let's just leave that hanging there for a minute. The dashas that we use in Indian astrology are the most important for timing events, along with transits. The transits are sort of like secondary thing. Just like with Western astrology, progressions are used and will along with transits. Dashas really show the timing of events, and she's in a Rahu Venus Moon dasha on three levels: Rahu, Venus, Moon. Rahu is quite obviously making her prominent, and that's quite a clear indication of her prominence right now, and why I would say, if anything, she's becoming president again by default and usurping Joe Biden's throne, and maybe even usurping Donald Trump's throne. And another thing to say about that, by the way, about Rahu and this Rahu type of person that she is, well, all politicians are Rahu type people anyway, but she is very Rahu type. And Rahu in Gemini, and if you read anything about her, political career, she's been able to really get in with the right people at the right time to get ahead. Essentially, that's essentially what Rahu in Gemini in the rising sign is about. It's this ability, again, just read the myth of Rahu if you're not familiar with it. It's essentially the ability to slip in wherever you need to slip in to get ahead, to do the networking that needs to be done. That's Gemini. The thing is, she is also this Rahu type of character, which is, remember, what eclipses the sun. Don't forget, Rahu eclipses the sun. What is the sun? Well, Donald Trump is a sun figure, a solar figure. He's ruled by Leo. He's a Leo ascendant. He is the sun. He was born on an eclipse, a lunar eclipse, but Rahu, the North Node, was with the sun in his 10th whole sign. So you could see how this is like almost being stolen from him in a way. And by the way, that's not to say that it literally is in terms of the contesting of this. I'm sure that is going to ensue. But what I'm saying is, I'm saying it metaphorically, that there is this kind of, again, usurping the throne. So that for me kind of tilts it in Harris's favor, but I just again don't think it's going to be a straightforward win. So that's Rahu. She's in Rahu Dasha overall. Rahu, by the way, is currently transiting Pisces, sidereal Pisces, which is her 10th host sign, which is her prominence right now. And when we get to the American Sibly chart at the end of this, I'm going to show you how the American chart is also in a Rahu period, and it's Rahu Mercury, and she is mercurial. She is ruled by Mercury. She's Gemini rising with Rahu and Gemini. That for me is a straightforward indication that she's fitting the current US zeitgeist in a sense. And in a way, it's kind of like the thing about this, and I really kind of struggled with seeing whether this Rahu US zeitgeist thing was another kind of shocking win by Trump or a shocking win by Harris in a way, because either would be shocking in a way. But I don't think Trump would be as shocking as 2016. In 2016, it was shocking. It was absolutely shocking. And it was a Rahu type of thing. And Rahu had just begun in the dasha sequence in the US chart. So that is more clearly showing that shock of his win in 2016. I don't know if that would be the case again if he won in 2024. It wouldn't be shocking, I don't think. So that then makes me lean again towards Harris, because Harris, it's not necessarily going to be shocking, but it's going to be groundbreaking. That's the other side of Rahu. And Rahu in her chart is exalted by many accounts in Gemini. And so it's maybe you could say highlighting the sort of more evolved state of Rahu. And what is that? It's essentially about innovation and the, what could be the most innovative thing of all of this is a Black woman becoming president of the United States, the first ever woman to become a president. That is the kind of last glass ceiling that needs to be broken through. So she could be the one to do that because of this Rahu in her rising sign and also now transiting her 10th house sign, the most prominent sign. There are a few things that go against that in a way, but like I said, that could be seen as the overall theme and the zeitgeist in the US right now, that this is the last sort of breakthrough in the US. It's not so much that it's shocking, it's more that it's groundbreaking. Whereas the previous 2016, it was shocking because of what Rahu was doing at the time. It was conjoined Jupiter, by the way, in Leo, retrograde Jupiter in Leo. That year was quite a breaking year. I mean, that was Brexit as well, in the UK. Things kind of like seemed to kind of take a turn in 2016 in a very shocking way because of that. And again, because it was the beginning of the Rahu phase in the Sibly chart, which I'll show you now as well after I show you their charts. When you begin the Rahu period, the dasha of Rahu, personally, the first 3 years are especially tumultuous, but it then settles down into a sort of orderly kind of way in a way. It's never really orderly in Rahu periods for sure. And it's not obviously in the US right now because they continue through the whole Rahu phase, but it's Rahu Mercury. And that for me is just, it's not like Rahu at the beginning of the Rahu phase, which was shocking. It was really shocking. This is like groundbreaking, I think. Now, it could be also that it's groundbreaking in other ways, and that there is going to be a contingent election, and that means that Harris maybe then becomes president, but then they have to elect a vice president, and that could be JD Vance. Because when we look at JD Vance's chart, he is very Rahu Mercury as well. Um, anyway, at any rate, let's maybe park that for a minute because I don't want to confuse the issue. But let me just look at another thing here in the chart. In the more immediate time frame, Rahu is the overall, as I mentioned. Venus is the sub period, which is so important. Venus is what is exchanging with the sun. In other words, then Venus, in a way, is going to trigger the sun in her chart, the sun in her fifth sign in her chart. She's coming up to her birthday, her solar return, solar lunar return for this full moon, opposite in Aries. This is a real trigger. And not only that, but Saturn has returned in her chart, and Jupiter has returned in her chart, and Mars will return in her chart. It's like one thing after another in her chart is returning to where it was when she was born. So we have the sun, the moon, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars. I mean, that's nearly all of the planets. So everything is aligning in a way for her at this time, I really feel. Um, but again, I don't think it's straightforward. Even if I was to end this video saying that Harris is the winner or Harris becomes president, I'm very careful in the way I say this because I don't know if she wins outright or she's eventually becoming president. But everything seems to be aligning for her in terms of the transits right now. So Rahu is one level, Venus is the second level. Venus again is making that sun activated here in the fifth house again of political power. And then the moon on the third level. The moon is again activated because of this full moon on the 17th of October in Aries and very close to her own moon. So that's an activation in her 11th whole sign. And it's exchanging with Mars in her second sign. So again, now it's activating Mars. So when you have planets exchange, so you can see she's got two exchanges going on, which is why she's just not, if she were just a straightforward candidate for presidency, first of all, she wouldn't be. She's been giving it in another way. And why she might become president in this kind of back doorway, in a way, by default, in a way, because of people not responding well to Trump, perhaps this time around, or whatever, or it had been taken from him, or whatever, in some other way, and handed to her. Now, for me, that just means contingent election, but it could be other ways. It could be just that she wins the popular vote because of people just not happy with a Trump presidency. I don't know. But this Moon Mars exchange between the second and 11th is also winning something. The 11th house is gaining something. And the second house here, and Moon very much about popularity. It's almost like she has seemed to be to me to be more popular now than when she was vice president, or she still is vice president, but when she wasn't the nominee. As soon as Biden handed over the nominee to her, she seemed to become more popular. She seemed to become more prominent. And I think she's gained from that popularity recently. So this Rahu Venus Moon, it's a popularity contest more than anything else. And when I show you this other thing in the chart now that's really important to look at, it might shine some light on that as well. But Moon again is about popularity, second house ruler in the 11th house, but exchanging with the 11th Lord. It seems to be she's gaining popularity in this current dasha, essentially. If we just look at the other dashas, the sign-based dashas, we have Narayana is one, which is Aquarius, her ninth whole sign. We have Virgo, which is another one, Chara dasha. This is the fourth whole sign, which is also ruled by Mercury, which is in her fifth sign. Again, political power. And then the birthday coming up, this is what's really interesting, is that her birthday on the 20th of October initiates the first house again. So she's coming into a perfection year of the first house of her prominence again. It's currently 12th house, but it's coming into first house. Now, speaking of the 12th, so all of those things for me suggest that's a positive timeline, essentially. But there's another thing to say here is that Jupiter is in the 12th house, which is active right now. And Jupiter is her 10th lord in the 12th house. And you'll see in all of their charts, well, the charts we have, I don't have again Tim Wall's birth time, but Harris, Trump, and Vance all have the 10th lord in the 12th house. And this is often said to be somebody who is in like a public office, like essentially like a public servant in a way. However, that obviously plays out in very different ways for different people. So she's a public servant, you might say. So this is Jupiter, the 10th lord in the 12th house. But what's really interesting about this Jupiter is this is the thing. This is why I'm wondering, if she's really running away with it because and if she is, it's not like clearly running away with it in terms of getting the popular vote. And that's it. She's elected president and she becomes president and full stop. That's it. Easy as. I don't think it's that because of this Jupiter. Because when we look at Trump's and Vance's chart, Jupiter is very active in their chart, especially Trump in the 10th house sign. And he's in a Jupiter period, a Jupiter dasha. She's not in a Jupiter dasha, though Rahu is in Jupiter sign, Pisces. She's in a Rahu dasha. Um, it's just not active in a very strong way for her. And now it's also, as it is in her birth chart, retrograde. It's in the 12th house and it's moving retrograde currently. And her 10th Lord moving retrograde in the 12th house just doesn't look overtly like sort of that's me winning the contest outright and I'm becoming the leader. It just doesn't look like that. And if it does mean she's leader, it's through some other means. I keep saying that, but this is what I'm seeing. So that's Jupiter in the 12th house. I will show though her before I look at one last point I wanted to make here about reputation and all of that. When I show you her yearly charts, it does become more prominent. It does definitely become more prominent. So we have to factor that in. So one other thing I want to mention here is the Arudha Lagna in Indian astrology, the attained ascendant. Arudha means attainment. Lagna is ascendant. And of course, her Lagna or ascendant is Gemini. And there's some debate about that in some circles. A couple of astrologers I follow, Vedic astrologers, have suggested that she's Taurus rising. We have her birth certificate. We have the print, we have the image of it even, and we can see the exact time written down. It is 21:28. I don't know if somebody would write down 28 minutes past 9 p.m. if it were not around that time, very almost exact. But some suggest that if she was born 5 minutes earlier, it would be Taurus rising. I don't see that Taurus fits her, to be honest with you. I see the Gemini, I see the Rahu very prominent in her. I do think this chart fits. But anyway, um, it is her. I'm going to use it. I'm just telling you that because some don't use it. But Gemini is her ascendant. Then we look at the ruler of Gemini, which is Mercury, and we count to Mercury in the fifth house sign. And then we count the same again to get a mirror image and how the person then is perceived by other people. We count from Mercury here in Libra to Aquarius, 5 signs. So this is her Arudha Lagna, her attained ascendant in Aquarius with Saturn retrograde. And Saturn, remember, is back here again, transiting. Generally, this is not necessarily a positive thing, although it might be a mitigating factor that Saturn actually is very powerful in Aquarius. It's its own sign. So in a way, protects her reputation, but it's still not going to make somebody become like super popular in another way. Saturn just doesn't do that kind of thing. It doesn't boost somebody in that way, but it's still more beneficial the fact that its own sign for sure. So it's kind of giving her that. But then Saturn, of course, next March, and we do have to think that in terms of the long term here, because what happens after this election is more interesting than what happens before the election in a way. There's got a lot of interesting astrology going on. By next March, Saturn goes into Pisces, and then will be the second sign from her Arudha Lagna. This is not positive in a way. This is less positive, let me put it that way, for her reputation. But let me remind you, folks, if you're listening to this and you're wondering, oh, who's going to win, Harris or Trump? This is going to make a big difference. I would suggest that actually it's not going to make a huge difference whoever wins, because it's always these political elites and powerful people that get elected. You don't become a president because you're not in these positions of power, whether it's Harris or Trump. And really, I think we all get hoodwinked every single time an election comes up, whether it's in US or your own country, wherever you are. we all start to think that, oh, this politician is going to make a real difference. It's going to change. And it never does. It never does. So it's going to be quite disappointing, I imagine, whoever wins, when you realize that actually doesn't really make any major changes in the world. Um, but anyway, at any rate, it's not positive from next March in terms of her reputation, but that doesn't mean she's not becoming president. It just might mean she becomes president and then she's not really fulfilling the role that people thought she would, or she's not doing all the things. Like every single time a politician says, I'm going to do X, Y, or Z, and then they backtrack on X, Y, or Z, you know, that could be that as well. So that's that. Now let's get into her yearly charts, and this might shed some more light. So we'll look at, first of all, the Varshapal or solar return for this year, which is on the 21st. It doesn't always have to be exact birthday. She was born on the 20th. The solar return is now the 21st, and I'll just flip over and you can see it here. So here we have the solar return, and I put in this Munta, which is the progressed sign for the year as well. Let me just stick it in here, and you'll see that it's become very prominent in her 10th house sign. This is showing the prominence for her for the year, for sure. She's going to be prominent anyway for the year. Either way, even if she doesn't win, she's going to be a very prominent person. Um, so what we could say about this chart, I mean, you have to look at the 10th Lord, obviously, as her position or prominence. It's Mercury, ruler of the first. It's in the second house. It's with the sun. The sun is always going to be in Libra for her solar return, of course, in debilitation, which is an interesting point as well. I want to say about the differences for that between Harris and Trump. Harris, again, has the sun in Libra and this kind of mitigating factor, that this exchange that kind of changes things for her. So even though she herself is not the kind of leader you would think of, like with Trump, who's a very solar sun figure and a very prominent sun in his 10th house, she's getting it like by default. Like I said, this is more positive, I think, for Harris. It's her birthday, after all. It's kind of reigniting her, rejuvenating her. Whereas for Trump, this is his Lord, the ruler of Leo, his rising sign, debilitated. And it's debilitated at the very time he needs the strength. And so this is a weak time for Trump, for sure. That isn't really as weak for Harris. So this solar energy here is like I said, it's not necessarily a bad thing for her, even if it's still a debilitated sun. So this chart isn't like mind-blowing. It does show the moon here in Gemini, the 10th host sign, as being popular, as being a popular vote. And, as many people say, the popular vote maybe being won now by a female candidate, being voted for by more females who obviously are very concerned about the abortion issue in the US, and so on and so on. I think, yeah, that itself is very telling. The nodes of the moon themselves, Ketu and Rahu here, the south node Ketu, north node Rahu in the first seventh, is maybe not necessarily straightforward again. If for me, again, it just highlights this kind of usurping the throne. I know I keep saying that, but I just do think that it's highlighted over and over again. Um, so yeah, I mean, I might not want to say any more about that. I want to actually show you the solar lunar return. This is called the Tithi, the lunar day, and it's a full moon, so it'll be the 17th of October. So I'm going to flip the chart again, and you can see it here. Actually, let me take out Munta now because you don't need to be looking all of this in all the charts. So I'm going to flip the chart here, and you can see here, this is her solar lunar. So the sun has just moved into Libra. It's very weak at the first degree. So it's on this cusp. So it's seen as very weak. It's moving into Libra anyway, which is weak. And then the moon has just moved into Aries, also very weak at this juncture between Pisces and Aries for her yearly chart. So even though it's a full moon, and you might say that's a strong moon, there's a weakness there as well. Here we have, though, what's interesting with Leo itself rising in this chart. Now, I use this chart more so than the Varshapal or solar return. So this is for me a better chart to use overall, but it is showing this prominence in another way. And we see here Leo rising, and Jupiter now is placed in the 10th for her, as it is in Trump's and Vance's birth charts. So she's picking up this Jupiter strength here, in other words. The ruler of the 10th, Venus, is in the 4th, opposite Jupiter. So it's benefiting as well from that, being in opposition to Jupiter. They're opposing each other or aspecting each other, looking at each other as well. So that might suggest that there's some, positive indications there as well. That's not a straightforward window again, and it's again retrograde Jupiter in her 10th house. So that's another thing to think about. And then the dasha sequence, the timing technique we use for this one is the Tithi Ash Totari. So I'm going to bring it up here. Let me just put it in. So here it begins with Saturn for her because she was born on a full moon. So the full moon is ruled by Saturn in the lunar days. So lunar day Saturn, then it runs in sequence Saturn, Jupiter, Rahu, Venus, and so on. So by the time she's going through the election from the 17th of October until the 24th of December, it's Jupiter Dasha in this particular Tithi Dasha. And Jupiter is again prominent in the 10th house. This for me is also why I lean towards Harris more. Even though I keep saying it, I don't think it's a straightforward win. I do lean towards Harris more because of these indications. And so she's picking up this strength that again Trump and Vance have in their birth charts in her yearly chart. This Jupiter strength in the 10th house, or this Jupiter prominence in the 10th house. Jupiter is about expansion, growth, and this for me suggests a stepping up in terms of her career. Again, I just don't think it's going to be straightforward, but that's an aside. So that is Harris. That is Harris's chart. I mean, there's always so much more we could look at, but I think they're the main points I wanted to highlight. Let me just maybe finish with her D10 because the 10th divisional chart shows somebody's career specifically. So we should be able to see either if somebody's stepping up in prominence or stepping down in this chart. And we can see here that Rahu is in the rising sign in Gemini again. So overall, this is a stepping up. This is again, like I said, maybe breaking the last glass ceiling there is in the US, in US politics. And Jupiter is the 10th Lord. And, Rahu is in the 10th house. And what can we say about the other period, Rahu and Venus and Moon? Well, Venus is the fifth Lord of political power in the 11th house of gains, gaining political power. Moon is in the 12th house, the second lord in the 12th house, maybe less so prominent here. But I wouldn't count her out just because of that moon on the third level in this particular chart. Again, it could certainly show, and because Jupiter is transiting the moon here, Jupiter, the 10th lord of this chart, again in the 12th house, transiting the moon, there could be a kind of mitigating factor there as well. But overall, I do think the Venus in the 11th house is a gain. It's a gain of something. And I did predict this in the beginning when she started Rahu, Venus, Venus. I thought she would become president actually. Rahu, Venus, Venus, way back in beginning of 2024. It didn't work out like that. It's just more, and she could still become president, by the way, like I said, before January, but she's become the nominee at least. So that's Rahu, Venus, Moon. I do think it's good for her. You can see here, as with Donald Trump, we have Jupiter in Capricorn, and it's very common. I've seen this a lot for people who get ahead in life, business, and in politics to have Jupiter debilitated in this chart, the 10th divisional chart. Because why? Because Jupiter is about ethics and morals, and you cannot have clean cut ethics and morals. Let me just say it. And this might sound controversial, but you cannot have like a clean cut moral stance on everything if you're to get ahead in politics. Politics is not about Jupiter. Jupiter and politics are not really the same thing. Rahu is about politics. It's about, power. And again, grabbing power, getting power through any means necessary. So you'll often see this as well in people who are very successful in business, this Jupiter in Capricorn. And again, she has it, Donald Trump has it. I'm not saying that's a minus for her. I'm saying that's a plus for her. Now, the issue here in her chart, though, apart from, Donald Trump's chart, is that she has it retrograde and it behaves as if it's exalted, therefore, in her D10. So she does have another, I think, moral stance that actually might not work for her. Because again, if Jupiter in Capricorn is good for people to get ahead because they'll do whatever it takes to get ahead, she might not be of that kind. She might not be willing to do whatever it takes. She might be more moralistic, and that doesn't work for her, you know? So that's actually a minus point, I would say, for her. But she's not in the Jupiter Dasha overall, remember. So that's maybe something to think about. Okay, I could go on and on about her chart, but I'm going to go on to Donald Trump's chart now. And then we'll look at his yearly charts as well. And then I'll finish with the Sibly, Sidereal Sibly chart. So this is Donald Trump's chart. And you all know his chart, I'm sure, at this stage. You can see as well that Jupiter is retrograde. So that's interesting because just what I said about the D10, as you can see, Jupiter again in the D10, the career chart is debilitated in Capricorn, but it's retrograde, behaving as if it's exalted. Is Donald Trump a very moralistic person? Maybe he is. I don't know. He's portrayed otherwise. Um, but we don't know that. We don't really know a person personally, do we? We're always like told what people are like by the media. Not, we don't really know them. But anyway, here goes. This is Donald Trump's chart. We have the dasha sequence here, which is Jupiter, and it's Jupiter, Venus, Venus. Jupiter is on one side of his ascendant, Venus on the other. This is like what is called like a protective yoga or combination. So the two benefics in the chart, either flanking his ascendant. This is why he didn't get killed, by the way, during the assassination attempt. I did a whole video on that prior. It's basically why he was shot in one way because of Mars and all of that, but why he also escaped, that. Jupiter's very protective. Um, Jupiter also rules his fifth and eighth house, so it shows his, a following and the kind of a lot of the unforeseeables as well that we can see here with the eighth house, but certainly a lot of controversy and scandal that follow him everywhere. But a big following. This is something he has in common with JD Vance, as I'll show you. Jupiter and Neptune conjoined, though Vance has it in Sagittarius. They both have that conjunction. They have a lot of similarities in their charts, by the way. Um, and that Jupiter, remember, again, overall is the key thing because the Jupiter is the circumstance overall. Jupiter is transiting his 10th house of prominence overall. This seems to me to be overall a very prominent time in his life. So why we cannot rule him out. And there are many things that could rule him out, by the way, and go against him in rulings as well, even like lawful rulings. But overall, there's still a prominence. But a prominence doesn't mean president. A prominence could mean that he is fighting through legal avenues and still prominent. Because what I want to say about Trump's chart is, as we'll highlight now, there's something in his chart that I would say he needs to be very mindful of, you know, more assassination attempts essentially leading into next year. And then when I saw that in his chart, as I'll show you now in the transits, I thought, well, if he's, you know, at risk of another assassination attempt, but that might actually not be attempt, but a successful assassination, why would anyone want to assassinate him next year unless he's president? And although I thought that, then a patron mentioned to me when I said this, the patron had mentioned that, well, he doesn't have to be president to be assassinated. He could just be contesting the presidency. He could be prominent in another way, delaying things and so on, or just continually protesting it and creating a lot of problems in the US. I just think he's still going to be very prominent next year. And as we see in the dashes, he's continuing to be prominent. Um, so anyway, Jupiter in the 10th house by transit. It is retrograde though. Now, this is where I do think Jupiter retrograde in the 10th house could show a going back and getting an opportunity from the past. In this case, literally going back and becoming president again. I don't know if this has ever happened before, where a president has an ex-president and then gains presidency again, not the second term, but like a next time. I don't know if maybe you can post below. I don't know. Does anyone know of a president that was president and then wasn't president and then was president again? Because this Jupiter in the 10th house sign retrograde is showing him like getting it again in one way. This is a very general reading of it, but that certainly could be the case. Because again, he's in a Jupiter dasha. Harris is not. And Jupiter is transiting his 10th house sign. That's not happening in Harris's chart. It does rule her 10th house sign, but it's in her 12th house of loss. So this for me then leans towards Trump, as you can see now, why I've been kind of going back and forth with either candidate. So that's overall. It's Venus. in the second level and third level throughout the election. And Venus is in the 12th sign, again, the 10th Lord in the 12th sign. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing necessarily, or just a straightforward loss. Even though, by the way, I did look into this, and in his life previously, Venus meant major losses, financial losses. He went bankrupt in a previous Venus sub period, Bhukti, and he's in that phase again. Um, but when we pair it with Jupiter, it's still overall quite positive because Jupiter, Venus, like I said, flanking his ascendant. We count from Jupiter to Venus and the same again. It ends up again in his 10th house. This is a technique in Vedic astrology. You count from the major lord, Jupiter, to the minor lord, Venus. That's 11 signs away. And you count the same again from Venus. You end up in the 10th house. He's prominent. This phase of his life is very prominent. So why we can't count him out at all. The sign periods then, this is very interesting because he's in Pisces in one, Narayana, the eighth house, not so great, lots of scandal, obstruction, delays, and all of that kind of thing. And then in the Chara, he's in Cancer, the 12th house, also not positive, losses. And as soon as he started this Cancer period, he really started to go down. Even though he was in power initially, he then it all went south for him basically. And, Cancer is the 12th house, of course, of loss, but is ruled by Moon, which is debilitated in Scorpio, conjunct the South Node, the eclipse. Now, he is, you might say, the usurper, but it's almost like he's like the usurper being usurped by Harris. That's almost like what it could seem like in this case. Um, but what's really interesting is that he's coming into Leo next June 2025 in both these sign-based progressions. Leo, his rising sign with the Mars prominent there, he's coming into prominence again. Now, it might, though, be for all the wrong reasons. This is the thing. So just because somebody starts their first sign over again, which means he's come all the way full circle by the age of 79, he's come full circle. It's starting Leo all over again. It's like a restart. But that might mean a restart in another way that isn't necessarily a positive thing. It doesn't mean it's positive, but he's still prominent. He's still in the headlines. I don't think this guy's going anywhere in terms of the headlines, but that might be because of things that's happening to him that, he may be being, I don't know, if he doesn't make it to being president, he could be charged. He could be, I don't know if he'll go to prison, but he could be charged. And, that is not going to look good for him. The 12th house is still activated until next June. So what I thought about more so about next June, though, more especially, is this Mars, because Mars will enter Leo by June 6th next year, 2025, and then will conjoin Ketu, the south node of the moon, in June and July. This is for me more an issue for him personally, and why I think he needs to be careful, because Mars Ketu is this kind of terrorist kind of thing, an assassination kind of thing. And by the way, Mars was in Gemini, aspecting Ketu by exact degree, a square aspect to Ketu in Virgo when that second assassination attempt took place. So it definitely looks like he's not safe in a way. So in a way, if he becomes president, that's not safe for him next June. It could be that there's just a lot of contesting the election until then, and it's not clear who's winning and so on. And because this Mars as well is going to be retrograde in Cancer initially in December, and then go back into Gemini and then go back into Cancer and not make it out of Cancer until June next year. For me, that really shows this kind of back and forth, and there's a lot of conflict going on with Mars in Cancer opposite Pluto and Capricorn. This is conflicted on every side, really. Doesn't matter who wins. I think it's really conflicted. It does, though, suggest to me that Harris winning would show more conflict than him contesting and his following contesting the election, which would lead to just an all-out kind of, don't want to say civil war, but like this just contesting and fighting and all of that. Whereas if we say Trump wins, which for me, again, I'm leaning towards Harris, even though I don't think it's straightforward. I'm leaning towards Harris because if Trump were to win, I don't know what would be who would be contesting if he just straightforward wins and he becomes president. Where is all this back and forth and contesting going on? At the same time, I do feel like he is in danger if he does win. I do want to say that because of Mars Ketu conjunction, so he has to be mindful. I mean, I do think it's obvious that if Trump wins, however he might win, whether it's the popular vote or not, or the contingent election, whatever, this means that yeah, he's in danger. I'm sorry to say, but I do think he is because I mean, why wouldn't it be? He's like he's not the establishment. He's not the established order, and yet all of these transits point to this kind of challenge to this the establishment and why in any way we would even consider Trump becoming president again and being elected president by the US people because the US people are just sick of the established order. And this to say as well that Pluto in Capricorn is showing the dismantling of the established order, right? And this Mars opposition in the coming weeks and months is showing that anger towards the established order and people wanting to kind of really expedite the collapse of the established order, essentially. So it's definitely not straightforward, is what I want to say. The perfection year is 7 year, and it won't change until next summer into the 8th year. So he's in the 7th year perfection, then into the 8th year. So that's not necessarily a positive thing. Again, there's a lot of negative things activated in his chart, and this is another point I want to make about their charts and why I think I'm leaning towards Harris because he has a stronger chart overall than Harris. Easy peasy. That's almost like just a straight read of it. However, because he's got so many other things going on right now with the 8th house and 12th house activations and all of these things, it's just like, again, she's kind of getting it by default because of what happens to him. Now, let's not rule out something happening to him and that he is no longer even in line for presidency, that he is not the candidate anymore, or that he is and then he's not. Let me put it that way. What about JD Vance? So I'm going to look at JD Vance now in a minute, but I want to just show you again the solar lunar return and the solar return charts for Trump. But first, before we get to that, also, again, there's so many things to look at, but the Arudha Lagna here is something that is a bit controversial in Indian astrology, but I want to mention it here because I mentioned Harris's in Aquarius. For Trump, it could be in Aquarius as well. But there's a rule, an exception rule here that's given by Parashara that you cannot have the Arudha in the first or the seventh house. This is debated by some astrologers that, it kind of makes sense that you can't have it in the first house because it's a mirror image of you, like in your reputation, that precedes you. So it can't be in Leo. But I would argue, and other people do argue, that it could be in the seventh house. Even though, again, Parashara says no, it can't be in the seventh house. So it then has to go to the 10th house from there, which is Scorpio. And so, by the way, let me back it up in case you missed that. You count from Leo to the ruler of Leo, and the same again. So from Leo to the sun is 10 signs away, Taurus, and 10 signs away from Taurus is Aquarius. So you would say his attained descendant, like Harris, is in Aquarius. Again, Saturn's transit here and subsequent transit to Pisces is not overall that positive in many ways for both of them. And you might say, actually, that's ringing true because neither candidate seemed to be super popular. I mean, if there was one super popular candidate, we wouldn't be having this issue. We would be just saying that this one person is standing head and shoulders above the other. That's not happening. They're neither of them at that popular. And that's, I think, because of this. But even if we use the exception of Parashara and say that it can't be in the seventh house, we have to count 10 from there again when we end up in Scorpio. And you might say that this shows his reputation in another way. Aquarius certainly does for both of them. But I also think Scorpio highlights this with Moon and Ketu and Scorpio. It does definitely show that in a way for Trump. But it's still problematic because Saturn in Aquarius is aspecting Scorpio. And this will be more problematic in a way. But then Jupiter is transiting opposite. So that might also protect his image, make him more popular. So yeah, it's kind of a mixed bag for both of them in terms of popularity votes. And let's face it, election votes are popularity votes. There's nothing really about, well, there's not as much about their policies as much as how popular are they. Let's call a spade a spade. It's really about the personality, isn't it? At any rate, let's go to the return charts. So let's first of all look at the Varshapal or solar return. So it was on the 14th of June this year, which is his birthday, and this is the chart. If I flip it over, And this is actually Leo rising again in this chart. So this is like the whole start over again. We can see here the very prominent 10th house again with Jupiter, Sun. And when we see this in the solar lunar chart, again, this is very prominent. So Sun in the 10th house, Mercury exactly conjoined the Sun, the 11th Lord. Jupiter there, the fifth Lord in the 10th house with Uranus also. It's definitely a prominent chart for sure. I think maybe in a way more so than Harris. But then if we look at the back to the birth chart for a second and then go back here and go to Tithi, the lunar day, which again, just like Harris, has to be a full moon. They were both born on a full moon, but with Trump being born on a lunar eclipse. And in a way, that kind of makes him more of the usurper in a way. But let's just keep it focused here. So this is a birth chart, and let's flip it now to the 23rd of May, which was quite a long time before his actual birth date. And again, it just because you can see here in his birth chart, the sun is at the very last degree of Taurus. So he can have his lunar return as soon as the moon opposes the sun in Taurus. So the sun can just move into Taurus. It could be a whole month before. And in fact, it was almost a month before. So in this year, it was the 23rd of May. The sun had moved into Taurus. This chart is really interesting. The sun had just moved into Taurus and the moon had opposed it. So it's a full moon. And again, the Tithi periods here are highlighted. The Saturn begins it, just like with Harris. Saturn rules the full moon. Then it's Jupiter, then Rahu, and then Venus. And Venus through the election. So Venus is activated in the election. Now, this is where it gets really interesting because, again, Taurus is rising, his 10th whole sign from his birth chart perspective, very prominent. Taurus rising. Taurus is ruled by Venus. Venus is in a planetary war at the same degree within just 4 minutes of arc of Jupiter. So right bang with Jupiter. Why is that significant? Because Venus is strong. It's in its own sign. It's higher by minutes than Jupiter. So wins this war between Venus and Jupiter. And Venus is the ruler of this chart and the sixth lord of this chart, which means winning a competition or winning a legal case and winning against Jupiter, the law. So this is really, for me, almost what would clinch it for Trump if I was just looking at this chart. And again, because the dasha is Venus and him winning a competition. So yeah, I mean, what else to say? Saturn is very prominent in here in Aquarius. It is transiting here, of course. That's what this return chart is. It shows the transits at any given time. And this chart and the activation of this chart and this Venus seems to me to be very prominent. He's not going anywhere, I don't think, anytime soon. And if he does go somewhere without suggesting what that might mean, I think he's still prominent. He's still in the news the whole time. So that's Trump's chart. Let me look at Vance and then I don't have Tim Wall's chart. I'm not even going to look at it without a time, but let me look at Vance and then also the Sibly chart to finish this up because this video is getting quite long. So let's look at JD Vance. So probably no surprise to see that JD Vance is Leo rising also, but what's I think very surprising and telling more than anything is that Mercury is rising in his sign Leo. And the current phase is Saturn, Saturn, Mercury on the third level. So Mercury is very activated. When we look at the Sibly chart now, we'll see that Mercury has to be activated in whoever candidate wins because it's the zeitgeist in the US right now. It's Rahu Mercury in the Sibly chart. Mercury is prominent. So unlike the previous cycle, which was Saturn in the US Sibly chart, which was Joe Biden, Saturn, and literally like Sleepy Joe, as Trump referred to him as, we're now in a different era. We're in a mercurial era, and we have to decide ultimately at the end of this video, I hope I will decide, who actually is the mercurial person more than anyone, because they're all mercurial in a way. Harris is mercurial because she's literally ruled by Mercury, Gemini rising with Rahu in Gemini, and she is Rahu Gemini. So again, the Sibly chart is Rahu Mercury. That seems to me, it's again to tilt towards Harris. But Trump is also very mercurial because he has Mercury in Gemini in his birth chart. And now Vance is also mercurial because he has Mercury in his rising sign and he's in a Mercury phase, Saturn, Saturn, Mercury. So just alone having Leo rising means that Jupiter is again prominent in the 10th house sign, but he's not in the Jupiter dasha in the time period of Jupiter. That's a point against him, I would say, even if the Mercury is helping him here. The Arudha is in Gemini because you count from Leo to the Sun in the 12th house. Again, you can see here the 12th house very active again. The 10th Lord Venus in the 12th house, Sun in the 12th house, Rahu in the 10th house. So many similarities between him and Trump. It's unreal. And then we count from again Leo to the Sun in the 12th, and the same again, we end up in Gemini. So Gemini is activated in some way here, in a big way. So, and it's in the 11th house of gaining, not necessarily popularity with Mercury, it's certainly but gaining recognition or gaining reputation. It's like a boost in his reputation. Saturn, Venus. I mean, overall Saturn Dasha, it's his seventh lord and sixth lord in the third house. It's a bit of a mixed bag, really, because it's exalted Saturn, but it's with Mars and Pluto. There's a lot of fighting going on here. And it's the sixth lord anyway in the third house. So there's a lot of fighting and maybe overcoming obstacles and competition for sure. And it could suggest as well, gaining something from the fighting, but a lot of oppositional forces here for Saturn for him. It's not like a straightforward, you know, prominent time win for him, but it is kind of something like Saturn, which is not the easiest time period for Leos, let's face it. Leo is about the sun and prominence. Saturn is about oppositional forces and competition and having to kind of take a step back and allow others to have more prominence. That's what Saturn's nature is. I wouldn't rule him out just for that, though. And again, it's Saturn, Saturn, Mercury, and Mercury in his first house is making him more prominent for sure. So Mercury's through the election, Saturn in his seventh house right now. You know, it's not like glaringly like amazing or anything. Now, Narayana Dasha is just begun in August. The sign Dasha of Sagittarius is fifth house sign. We can see your Jupiter, Neptune, just like with Trump. And this is fifth house following. So there's a big focus here on fifth house, but also political power. Just don't forget political power for politicians is fifth house. Aquarius is activated in this Chara period. Seventh house again, very activated, but also in the perfection year, it's fifth house. So there definitely is like gaining following. I don't know if it's like him coming into prominence in that way now or not, but definitely being more prominent and maybe building following. We might say that all of these years, and we have to say that Sagittarius is activated until 2036 over many, many years because Jupiter sits in Sagittarius. He gets the full 12 years of Sagittarius. So him building a following in this next many years, essentially. Um, yeah, that's I'll look at his yearly chart. I mean, I know I'm making this video too long, but let me just look at his Varshapal first of all. So this is Vance's Varshapal, Libra rising. 10th house sign's got the sun. Yeah, it looks good. And the 10th lord is in the ninth house. Again, it's Gemini. That looks good too. That definitely looks good for him in another way. Let's look at the Tithi Pravesh, this solar and lunar return for the year. So his birthday is on the 8th of November, but the solar lunar was on the 10th of August. Sorry, his birthday is on the 2nd of August, and this is on the 10th of August. So we have Libra again rising, interesting third house, really activated for the year for him for sure. And now we have the 10th Lord in the first house. This is again prominence, Sun in the 10th house. Yeah, there's a lot of prominence here in this chart actually. Um, and then we look at the dasha that will be running through the election will be the moon itself, the 10th Lord in the first house. And it's Lord Venus in the 11th house with the sun in the 10th. This is a strong combination going on here. This is a very strong combination going on for Vance. And at any rate, let's finish up this video because it's getting long enough. So we'll talk about, to finish, the Sibly chart. So I'll just put in America. Here. Thank you for bearing with it if you've stuck this far. Okay, let me just see where I can bring up American chart without bringing up people's details. So, mm, mm, mm. For some reason America is not coming up. I did put, yeah, there it is. Okay. Now, so this is the Sibly chart. So obviously most people are used to using Sagittarius. That's tropical Sagittarius, but even Vedic astrologers use Sidereal Sagittarius because of a Vedic astrologer rectifying a later time. This is the time that's most used, 10 past 5 in the evening on the 4th of July, 1776. So this has to be at that time, Scorpio, 21 degrees of Scorpio, Sidereal Scorpio rising. What's so fascinating about this chart, and I knew that it was going to come, and I did predict it previously, as soon as Rahu Mercury kicked in after Rahu Saturn, that I thought there would be a change. This is actually one of the main reasons I thought Kamala Harris would become president because of her mercurial nature. And again, Rahu in Gemini, that's why. So Rahu Mercury is activated right now, and Rahu Mercury are together in this chart in the ninth whole sign of law. And so she is that way. She is the prosecutor. She is the law. This is almost like why I see her in a way edging it because she is the prosecutor. It's like she is usurping his challenge to the throne again. So through the law. So for me, through the law means that it's again not straightforward. I don't think anything in Rahu is ever straightforward, by the way. But this for me means that it's not a straightforward win and that's it. And even if she does win the vote and that's it, she's going to be elected president in January or inaugurated, I that itself isn't straightforward, I don't think. And at any rate, it's Rahu, Mercury, and this ninth house and Mercury retrograde as well. That's the other thing. Um, yeah, and all in the ninth house. The ninth house is the worst place to put Rahu in a sense. So it's, it's creating a lot of issues around laws, essentially. And we're seeing that obviously. And it's Mercury, the eighth lord in the ninth, you know. And for Scorpio rising, Mercury is the eighth and 11th lord, which just exaggerates all these eighth house matters and conflicts and all these planets in the eighth house. So many different issues here. What's so fascinating is Mars is retrograde in this zone in Cancer and then going back into Gemini and conjoining the sun of this chart, the leader, literally the leader. It's the sun, but it's also the 10th Lord leader. Sun at 22 degrees of sidereal Gemini. Saturn or Mars will exactly conjoin this by the time it stations to go direct again by the end of February. I just feel like there's a lot of contesting the leadership in the US. And I, again, don't see that really as Trump's leadership contested as much as Harris's leadership contested. So that's again what makes me lean towards Harris. Um, so much more we can always say about these charts, but if we look at some sign progressions, it's Taurus, and Pisces is activated here as well. And perfection year, we have the ninth itself, which is again highlighted so much. Like now, and this is another technique when you have two planets together in a sign, it can also activate the opposite sign because they both aspect, obviously, the opposite sign here in a sense, even though, Rahu is a whole other ball game in terms of aspecting opposite, because here we have the south node of the moon opposite with Pluto and in Capricorn, and Pluto is transiting here, has returned here, and Mars will oppose here. And this is why for me it's all fighting and legal battles, more especially. It doesn't always have to be actual fighting, even though third house is certainly like war like. But the ninth house, third house axis being so activated in this chart for years to come now, by the way, Rahu Mercury, then Rahu Ketu. This for me shows a lot of fighting, legal battles going on. So it is not going to be straightforward. And the fact that Mercury is going to go retrograde by the end of November into December, end of November to the middle of December in Scorpio. Again, it sits in the ninth house here, but it's transiting the Scorpio ascendant of the American chart. Shows there's going to be a whole sort of back and forth along with the Mars retrograde in the ninth house, going back into the eighth house, conjoining the sun here and all these planets in the eighth house. Lots of contest, a lot of conflict, a lot of back and forth. It's going to be drawn out, I think, a lot. So What am I going to say? What am I going to say? I'm going to say that it seems to be tipping towards Harris in the astrology, and it's not straightforward. And to the point where it could not be any more crooked in a way. It could be that it's something that's contested for a long time and there might not be a president elected straight away, or even a contingent election that means that she is kind of given it in a way, but not voted in, but then given it by the House and then the Senate, maybe even electing Vance as a vice president. Or it could go the other way. It could also go Trump's way in that way, and then, Walls, I guess, as vice president. I don't know how that actually works. Again, there hasn't been a contingent election in the US in nearly 200 years, but maybe that's a dramatic, too dramatic a thing to say about it. What I do want to say and finish on this point is I do think it's tipped in favor of Harris. If I have to make a prediction, I would, if gun was at my head and I had to make a prediction between both, I probably would say Harris reluctantly because again of it not being straightforward. And that would be very reluctantly because I really don't think we can count Trump out. And that's what I'm going to say. I'm going to leave it there. If you have any questions, please feel free to post below. If you have any thoughts about that, please keep your thoughts astrological, not political. I have no affiliation here. I don't have a clue really about their politics. Um, and as I said before, I don't know if it matters. We do this every time there's an election in every country. Everybody gets all sort of like hopeful that it's going to change something, and then it doesn't change it. They are the political elite or the elite in some way that run countries. They're not for the everyman, in another way. Whatever it seems that they say, they are not because they are in a position of power for a reason. You don't get into positions of power for no reason. You're willing to do whatever it takes to get there. And that alone shows the confluence in terms of Rahu type significations, the kind of Rahu type roguery that is prevalent in politics and always will be. It always will be the case. That's never going to change. So let's not get our hopes up about whoever is elected in the US or whatever country you're in with all these many elections going on all year. And let's maybe just remind ourselves that, it's our own personal power that is important here. And the only power that we have in this case, you might say, is actually voting. Um, and that doesn't mean just going to the ballot and voting, by the way. That also means voting every day of our lives for what are we giving our attention to and what way do we want to live and how do we want to treat other people and all of these things. Every time we do anything or think anything and say anything, we're making a vote. And I guess I'm so glad that this is going to be over more than anything else because I don't want to think about this election anymore. It's taken up so much of my headspace that it's just not been healthy, even. Yeah, so we shall see. I'm fascinated though by it, of course. That's the other thing about Rahu. It is fascinating, Rahu, but it's disturbing. And I'll be glad when it's over. And yeah, let's see what happens. It's going to be interesting. Okay, until next time.